I'm a librarian here, and we're very pleased to welcome David Beale, who is the project director for the, or field director for the archaeological excavation that's taking place right now at the Green Mountain Power hydroelectric facility at Huntington Falls in Weybridge. And so let's please welcome David Beale.
All right. Hello, my name is David Beale, as Chris said. I work for Northeast Archaeology Research Center. It's a company out of Maine, and for the last, since 2008, so for the last 7 years, we've been working along the Otter Creek, working with first OMIA and then CVPS and now Green Mountain Power on a dam relicensure project, which basically means every 25 years, dams have to be relicensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And what they have to do is they have to assess the impact that dam is having on environmental and cultural resources. So that's what we've been doing. There are three major, three major developments: Huntington development, Belden's development, and Proctor development. And these run from New Haven right down to Proctor, almost Rutland. And along that 9 miles of river impoundment, we've found 19 archaeological sites that are or probably are eligible for the NRHP, which is the National Register of Historic Places. And there's a variety of strategies we're using to preserve those sites and or gain information from them. Some of the sites are not being affected by erosion in such a way that they need to be dug out before they disappear. Some can be protected with riprap and things of that nature, shoreline protection. Others, we're just monitoring the situation to see what the erosional effects over time are. But the one we're doing right now at Weybridge is in severe danger of erosion. So we're working a lot there to get a lot of information out of there as much as we can before it's lost into the river. So as archaeologists, we break the Native American past into four pretty distinct periods. The Paleo-Indian period, running from about 11,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. The Archaic period, which runs from about 8,000 years ago to about 3,000 years ago. And the Woodland period, running from 3,000 years ago to about 1400. And then what we have is the contact period, where Euro-Americans and Native Americans finally met, and we have pretty distinct typologies. We can kind of tell by what kind of tools they're using and what they're leaving behind in the archaeological record as to how they're making their living and what the environment was like. Most of these points you see, we've been able to essentially discover what time period they're from by finding them in what we call intact features, which is the remains of a hearth or a fire pit or a storage that can be carbon dated. So we have pretty reliable sequence of events of how these points evolved over time and how their hunting strategies evolved over time as well. And each period has pretty distinct cultural aspects to it. The first period, the Paleo-Indian period, of course, is kind of like you'd see in Ice Age movies. It's small bands of people following large game, like mammoth and mastodon, which we know were here. We don't have any mastodon kill sites in Vermont, but we have them in New York and we have them in Maine, and there's no doubt that they were also pursuing these kinds of resources. That period began about the time of deglaciation. Of course, nobody lived under the ice. It was there for much too long. But as the glacier started to recede, what you had was an open tundra environment. And in that environment, there's not a lot to forage for. So you have to basically find large animals that you can subsist on for a long period of time. And what we see is that, as we can see here, they're using spears. You had large points, what we call fluted points, with flakes taken off either side of it, so that they could be hafted onto a spear and, in a concerted effort, take down a large animal. And often these materials come from very far away. It's not atypical to find stone tips of this kind from thousands of miles away. They were very broad-ranging nomadic peoples who probably had trade routes that intersected over the whole of the continent. After the Paleo-Indian period, we get to what we call the, well, that says woodland, but the Archaic period, in which the forests start to come back. So you have people now able to subsist on a much larger variety of plants and animals. So what you see is people are becoming a bit more sedentary. They're able to stay in one place for a few weeks or a few months, a season. And while doing so, they're trying to store up resources for the next season. The fellow on the left here, he has what's called an atlatl, and this was kind of like a dog throwing, ball throwing thing, except with a spear on the end of it. And this was the most common type of projectile weapon until the introduction of the bow about 2,000 years ago into North America. And also at this time, we see that Native Americans are beginning to work with wood a lot more. We find what we call ground stone tools. These are very smooth, wedge-like objects and chisel-like objects that were used to carve wood, and often by burning it first and then chipping away at it and burning and chipping away at it. And when we find them, usually they're very, very smooth. They're extremely smooth. And those are typical of this time period. So
Dogs then?
it's likely, yes. I mean, we do find dog remains and you know, in attendance with Native American remains pretty much throughout the entire sequence of human occupation. So it's likely dogs came when people did.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They were certainly backup food, but they were also, you know, companions. And of course, people use dogs to hunt now, and they certainly did then. But as the gentleman says, they were definitely a resource you could utilize when you couldn't find anything else. So now we look into the woodland period, which is, I don't know, kind of more typical of what we think of as Native Americans. It's village settings where they're growing corns, beans, and squash. You see the rise of a settlement pattern in which people are no longer, you know, having to follow the game necessarily, but they're going to local resources that contain a lot of resources that they can exploit, like falls and stuff, so they can collect a lot of fish or a lot of nuts or something and then process them as a group. The earliest dates for corn cultivation in the state of Vermont are from about 1,100 years ago. So, and that's up in Swanton. And right now, or not right now, but we will be working on a site lower down in Proctor that has a date for corn. We found some corn remains there from about 600 years ago. So it's likely there was some, you know, pretty extensive settlement at that time. So, and as we move out of the woodland period into the contact period, you see that Native American culture changes with it. As they gain access to European trade goods, they no longer rely on the stone tools anymore. They start making tools out of what are called trade pots, which were copper kettles, which the Europeans intended for them to use for cooking, but instead they would cut them up and they would use them as arrowheads or decorations and things like that. But with that, you also had disease. The Europeans brought the trade goods and they also brought disease. So in the state of Vermont, it's estimated that by about 1760, 90% of the Native American population had been wiped out by disease, indirectly, you know, just through disease traveling around all of the Northeast. And that's when you get to the European settlement. And when Europeans first started extensively settling Vermont in about the mid-18th century, the land was largely clear. I mean, there were certainly, of course, Native Americans left, but the large populations, the large villages that have subsisted for so long were no longer present. Oh, well, all right. This is a map of the impoundments. You can see the Huntington Falls development up here, and Belden's, which is a little lower, and then Proctor down there. Those are physiographic regions. It's climate and, you know, plants and animals and stuff like that, but that's not really. Here's a drainage map depicting the different drainages existing in Vermont. You can see that all the developments are within the Otter Creek drainage, so everything tends to go down to the Otter and flow southward. Let's see. this is what we've been doing. So since 2008, we've been working on the Otter Creek, working with first OMIA, then CVPS, and then GMP to get their relicensure. And during that time as well, we were connected with the University of Maine at Farmington and are no longer. So we're our own company now. So we have all these names, but it's all doing the same exact thing. It gets a little confusing when you're writing reports sometimes. So during the course of that, we defined 36 what we call archaeologically sensitive areas. That's usually an area right at a confluence of a tributary and a major stream or across from it, where we generally find that Native Americans at least stopped for a minute to do things. So we'll find what's typical is lithic debitage, which is tiny chips from making stone tools, or fire-cracked rock, which is basically before Native Americans started utilizing pottery about the Woodland period, so about 2,000 years ago. It would be typical that they would boil things in leather or birch vessels. And of course, you can't place these directly in or on a fire because they'll burst into flames. So what they would do is take fist-sized stones, put them in the fire, and then when they were hot, take them out and put them in the bag, and then keep a round going until you had enough heat energy in there to actually boil the food in there. So that's a very important resource for us because you can imagine it takes a lot of stones to do that. So you find that kind of litter all over the place. There's very little in the record that remains that's organic in nature. We find very little bone unless it's been burned, what we call calcined bone, which stops the process of degradation. We find very little as far as leather or cordage. The soil in New England is very acidic. It just does not lend itself to that kind of preservation. So, you know, there are certain instances in an anaerobic environment like a deep alluvial site or something marshy or swampy where it stops the rot. But generally speaking, what we're finding is stone and a little bit of pottery. So this is the Proctor development. Within the Proctor development, we found two sites. One right near the Marble Bridge. Does everybody know where the Marble Bridge is? Right underneath it, basically, on someone's lawn, which was, they were very nice. They were kind enough to let us do the excavations there, even though we moved a lot of dirt. That site was probably an archaic site to the Woodland period, which means basically you had a couple of different occupations over time. What we found there was, again, the remains of stone tools, and what we found are cores, which are basically a piece of stone that people are taking larger flakes off of to make the tools themselves. So what we called is a lithic reduction site. And the other site, the one at the bottom, we haven't gotten to yet. I mean, we haven't done the phase 3 mitigation of, but last year we did find the core in there, and we found some pottery, which indicates to us that it was a more sedentary village setting. We'll be doing more extensive excavations there to kind of zone in on it and see how extensive that was. Let's see. In the Belden's development, there were 8 sites. Most of these were pretty transitory sites that we don't have very good dates for. We found, again, concentrations of fire-cracked rock and lithic debitage, but no real evidence of when the occupation occurred. So, I mean, there's good sites for sure. There have been some diagnostic artifacts found that let us know through the process of elimination when they might have been there, but no direct carbon dating to tell us exactly when. Let's see. Huntington Falls, we have 9 sites total. Some of these are very rich sites. You can see the one at the bottom, VTAD 1550, at the confluence of the New Haven and the Otter. That is a very, very extensive site, highly stratified. We have occupations about a meter down, separated by silt deposits that tell us they were there from about 4,000 years ago until about the contact period. And we have verifiable dates and some bones. We had a really extensive cultural feature, what we call, again, a fire hearth or a storage pit. But this looks like it was a single roasting episode where we found hundreds and hundreds of bits of burned deer bone. So it was, and we found also the tools they used to process that animal and right around it. So that's pretty exciting. You can kind of get an idea of what people were doing and how they lived and stuff. Let's see. This is some phase 1, what we call, during the phase one, what we do is we dig very small 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter holes just to see what's there. It's basically a game of battleship. We're just putting in these holes and seeing where we hit. That one up there by the Marble Bridge, as you can see. And it's kind of interesting. You can see we're working in the summer and the fall. Sometimes we're wrapped up. Sometimes we're just sweaty and disgusting. But yeah. And also, along all these sites, at each dam site, there's, of course, a marble works. As you know, Vermont is very heavily into marble and was even more so back in the past. So we've also done some historic archaeology on these sites to try to understand who was working there and what the conditions were. What we've found is, a series of quarries and mills and worker housing. Those kinds of excavations are a little, they're different because we end up with a lot of historic information that is close enough to us that we think we understand it, but is often not the case. But we haven't really focused too extensively because there are still structures standing in most of these places, and we do have a written history of them. So it's definitely different than the Native American sites where we do not have a written history and we kind of have to guess the best we can given the information we can get. Again, here's a railroad bridge down in Proctor. This was actually the site of one of the first bridges over the Otter Creek in the post-Revolutionary War period called Federal Bridge, which was built and rebuilt many times. Now I think it's a kind of tentative snowmobile bridge, but it moved from Federal Bridge, which was an important connection across the creek, to a railroad bridge, which was integral to the marble works, and a recreation bridge essentially. So you can kind of see how a good spot to cross a river is always a good spot to cross a river. We didn't find any Native American component here, but just less than a mile upstream there was. So it seems likely that it would have been used as a crossing point all through the period. Yeah, this is again the site I was talking about where we found the corn. It's likely a village site, as I was saying. Right now we have to wait again until the corn is cut before we can really get into it. But you can see on the right-hand side of the picture how that bank is slumping. And as you know, since Irene, the erosion has gotten substantially worse in many places. And this is definitely one of those places. It's likely that this site extended much further than it did, but it's being lost at a very rapid rate. Did you have a question, Chris? Oh, okay. Let's see. This is what we call the features. Those strings are defining these patches of earth that are either altered by fire or there's the presence of carbon, charcoal essentially. And we can kind of tell when we hit them because they don't look like the surrounding soil. Essentially, every time you have a fire, you're altering the soil underneath the ground. You're making it darker, redder. And also, you'll find that the organic remains kind of settle in one spot. So you have this strange shapes in the ground sometimes. Sometimes you'll find artifacts right within them, sometimes on top of them. But it helps us to identify where we should look and where we should get our radiocarbon dates from. Again, this is phase one survey. Within the Proctor development, we had a different kind of challenge because it's a much wider floodplain and the river has meandered very much over the years and even, more so since it's been dammed. So what we have there is the presence of what we call a post-settlement alluvium. Basically what that is after deforestation, after people moved in and started to farm the land and took the forest down, the land was no longer stabilized. So you had a rapid buildup of silt. And that rapid buildup of silt is anywhere from about 30 centimeters to 2 meters deep. So we had a particular challenge trying to, because we'd find ASAs or archaeologically sensitive areas, but we didn't know if the siltification had proceeded to a point where we wouldn't be able to dig below that level. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out where we could dig and where we could reach what we call an intact surface, a surface that may have stood before Europeans came. That was a major part of that. But Belden's and Huntington were much kinder to us. There were some terraces that were, deep alluvial, but for the most part, they were kind of like on the left, that picture there. You can see the severe erosion, but they were enough above the river so that we didn't have to deal with figuring out if there was even possible to find Native American remains there. Let's see. This is an interesting cave at Belden's Falls. We know, of course, that Native Americans utilized caves for shelter, for purposes we probably don't even understand. We haven't yet dug here because it's kind of difficult. I don't think we have any experienced spelunkers in our company, so it's a dangerous pursuit, and we haven't quite gotten into it, but we'd certainly like to see what's in there. And again, this is a site right down by, when you go over the covered bridge, and you take a right, and right past the recreation area there's a sheep farm where a llama is often wandering about. That's right there. And the llama was very nice to us. It took a while for her to get used to us, but once she did, she was pretty cool. It was pretty fun. But yeah, we have some artifacts over on the table, a lot of which are from this particular site. Again, this was pretty extensively occupied. We have evidence of occupation from about 4,000 years ago, right up to the period of contact, so 1600s. And a little further up from here, we also found a coin from the War of 1812. So that was pretty interesting. We don't usually find colonial historics so much, or that early period. It's usually 19th century kind of things, like pieces of broken plates and square nails and things like that. But this site actually yielded some fairly early historics that we don't typically find. And again, you can see those patches in the walls. You kind of get an idea of how the silt builds up over time. The very bottom layer, that orange stuff, is, it's probably been there for a few thousand years, and then over time you have this buildup, and the real gray stuff, the gray black stuff, that's all within the last couple of hundred years. That's the post-settlement alluvium. So you can see how much more extensively that's built up in the last few hundred years ago compared to the stuff that built up over the course of probably 4,000 or 5,000 years. These are some tools we found at the campgrounds. Oh no, actually this is from the site with the llama on it. We call it llama site in our heads. I forget the number sometimes. But you can see out in the upper right-hand corner, we have a drill, which Native Americans would have used to drill leather and wood. It's not something we find a lot, so it's pretty exciting. On the left-hand side, you see a projectile point. This is typically a contact period point, so they get essentially smaller over time. It's not a given, but it's a general rule we use. Down at the bottom right, we have a typical example of a Lavana point, which is pretty extensive with the introduction of bow technology about 2,000 years ago. You see they stopped using the tangs on the blades to tie them in. They were probably using some kind of natural epoxy, some kind of tar to glue it essentially to the shaft of the arrow. And on the bottom left, we have a scraper. These are interesting little objects that were used to scrape hides, to remove sinew and fat from hides, and probably also to do some light woodworking and things of that nature, anytime you need to smooth something down. The object in the middle is very interesting. It's an incised piece of slate, which, as you can see in the illustration, is maybe a sun, maybe an eye, maybe a sunfish, not sure. But we don't really know if it's Native American or if it was some child 100 years ago. But it's interesting because we found it in context with these other things, even though we can't date it, and it wasn't found in or near a feature that we could reliably date with carbon-14. But still an intriguing object. And here we have pottery, Native American pottery, which is typical in the broad woodland period from about 2,000 years ago to the point of contact. It was made from local clays, and what they would do is is anybody familiar with Vergennes clay? Which is, yeah. Exactly. I know it's annoying, but it makes very good pottery. It's even more annoying to dig in, trust me. I mean, excavate centimeter by centimeter. But they would take this clay and they would wash it and clean it and soak it, and then they would add gravel to it to give it, some structure. and it would be baked. And you can see by the decorations, this is one of the best resources we have for understanding what kind of cordage they used, how they were working with textiles, because of course the textiles themselves are gone, but they leave an impression. And one of the really intriguing things about it is we often find fingerprints and hair within the clay. And that, of course, is something that's not going to last at all. To find a fingerprint from 2,000 years ago is pretty cool, actually. But we haven't, in the site we're at now, we haven't found anything like that, because usually that's associated with a more settled plot of land where people are remaining for a long time. The site we're working at now, again, a marble site, this one right here, it's right at the portage point. So it's right over the falls. And as now, it's a canoe portage, and it's likely that it was a canoe portage right through the entire occupation of Native Americans. And what we're finding is that we're finding evidence of small fires and small, like, fixing of tools. So you'll find a lot of little flakes, but not any indication of large-scale reduction. And as we've been digging in the last couple of weeks, we've found that we've got distinct areas of stone, kinds of stone. So in one part of the area, we have what we call rhyolite, which is it's a good material when it's first made, but it degrades very quickly. It's mostly calcite, and it just weathers away to essentially nothing. And then in the middle part of the site, we have what we call chert. It's a more glassy material, and it's usually dark gray to black to tannish in color. And then the southern portion of the site, we're finding a lot of quartzite, Cheshire quartzite, which is commonly available all over Vermont. So it looks like what we have is, if not 3 different temporal occupations, at least 3 different activity areas. But I tend to think it's temporal occupation as well. So you can see how the same site was utilized over time for the same purposes by a variety of people, whether they be Native American or us. And that's pretty significant for us. And what you can see up here is what we call the fire-cracked rock, those rocks with all the charcoal around them. That's typical of what we find as a fire-cracked rock feature. But also, when we find those, we don't often find anything else within that spot. It's kind of like they were dumping them as they were using them. So you don't typically find anything else, but you get really good dates off of it, so that's good. You can see in the bottom picture how severely the site is being undercut. The trees are just falling back, and as the trees fall in, they take material with them, and it just increases the erosion, which is why we're spending so much time on the mitigation of that site. And this is the campground site. You can kind of see you have 2 terraces there. As the alluvium builds up, it forces the rivers out, and you get kind of this wavy effect as different terraces are built at different levels as the river deposits silt in different areas. Let's see. And again, these are some stone points that were found at that site. It's interesting because the triangular ones, as I said, are Levana. They're more typically woodland period, so a couple thousand years ago. In the upper right-hand corner, though, we have a very interesting Genesee point, or at least the bottom of it. Typically, that would have been probably about this long when it was first made, and definitely a spear point, essentially. And this is from the late Archaic, so this is, it shows us that they were occupying, again, the site for a long range of time. And that's been fairly typical of the well-populated sites on the Otter Creek, is that we find they were good spots 4,000 years ago right up to now. I mean, there's campgrounds, there's portage spots that were likely used as campgrounds and portage spots back then as well. And we can see the variety of materials as well. Those 3 on the bottom and the 2 at the upper right-hand corner that's Cheshire quartzite. Again, it's very common. And then the 4 on the left up there are chert. It seems likely that the spear point bottom is from Mount Independence chert, so down in the lower Champlain Valley. And the upper left-hand corner is what we call Hathaway chert, which is from Hathaway. And so it's typical to find these materials, this mix of materials. It's not necessarily indicative of a certain age, but there seems to be a tendency in certain ages to use more or less of one material, and so you'll typically find it more. And now, this weekend, we'll be having a public outreach program. So from 9 to 3 on Saturday and Sunday, if you'd like to come out to VTAD 350 at the Weybridge substation. And I can show you around the site, and I can show you what these features are. We haven't found a lot of diagnostic tools, but we've found parts of tools and a lot of lithic debitage. But it's still interesting to see. So if you'd like to come out, please do. And we'd enjoy having you there, and we'd like to show it to you. And any questions, I suppose? Yes?
You mentioned a couple of times the site where the new haven comes in, the site in Proctor.
Uh-huh.
Stuff to about 4,000 years before
Yep.
present. Do we have any evidence that Paleoindians were using the Otter Creek in any previous?
No. I mean, gentleman's asking about Paleo-Indian use of the Otter Creek.
In other words, everything you found doesn't go back any further than about 4,000 years.
Right, so far, yeah. And it's not likely we'll find anything beyond the Archaic period. The Paleo-Indian period is defined, as I said, by open tundra. They weren't necessarily settling by rivers or even using them, as far as we know. You don't get the use of canoes and travel on the rivers until the Middle Archaic period, when that's when you get the woodworking tools and stuff like that. It seems more likely that the Paleo-Indian people were, again, following herds of animals, not willy-nilly, but kind of on a seasonal round as the animals migrated. So they were less dependent on the rivers, or not dependent actually at all. They were probably just barriers to them crossing. So that may be why we're not finding it there. But there are Paleo-Indian sites in Brandon and in the Otter Creek Valley, just not close to the river.
Well, this area would have been underwater, would it not?
During
There was a sea and a
there was a sea.
freshwater lake.
There was the Champlain Sea, which is where the Virginia's clay comes from. Exactly. But what we find is that we find high spots where we're finding Paleo-Indian sites. So we're not quite sure exactly how it worked, and we don't have any dated sites, but we have by point typology. We have the typical fluted points from the Paleo-Indian period found on these kind of high terraces. So we're not quite sure how they were navigating around the Champlain Sea or what its exact level was at what time, but they were definitely here. It's just very scant evidence for it.
I'm just curious, most of the sites you investigated were upstream of the dam, the project.
Right.
Why is that? Is that because of fluctuating water levels is what you're concerned about?
Yes, it's the impoundment. So between the dams, you have the fluctuating water levels that are impacting environmental and or cultural resources. That's the FERC relicensing is an assessment of that impoundment. I mean, typically, if we went all down the Otter Creek, we'd probably find a lot more sites. But yeah.
Huntington Falls below.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not. I've been working on it so long, but in there. But yeah.
So my question is, so there's really two really distinct terraces there?
Yes.
One where the picnic table is, and
Mm-hmm.
and we were down there last year.
At the campground? Yeah.
No, on below the Huntington Falls Dam.
Okay, yeah.
And you had excavated down to a hearth or
Mhm.
something like that, which I assume was the 1,600-year-old date comes from?
Yep.
And I'm trying to remember, was that in the upper terrace or the?
That was the upper terrace.
Okay.
Yep. The lower terrace, we did dig a series of test pits there, and we did find some lithic debitage. But it seems likely that would be a more recent occupation there, the Woodland period to the early contact period, because that landform was definitely utilized by Native Americans, but not the higher landform had a lot more evidence of occupation, as stone tools, bits of stone tools, pottery, as I said, that feature with the deer in it, the deer bones and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Most of these sites transitory?
It seems.
Proctor possibly a village?
It seems. Aside from Proctor, which looks like, you had a much more sedentary occupation for at least a growing season because there's corn, and it seems likely that they would have at least, if not stayed there all year long, come back to it during that period. But yes, most of these sites are very transitory sites. They're, as I said, are like the portage around the falls and stuff like that. So you'd set up for a night or maybe a couple days, maybe even a week if there's a sufficient amount of resources being presented, but no more than that. We definitely don't see large groups staying for a long time. They're very transitory sites. Yes?
At these sites, are you finding any fishing implements?
Well, unfortunately, bone doesn't preserve very well in New England, and it seems likely they would have used bone fish hooks, or, and we can't reliably say that they were using this point for spearing fish or spearing deer or arrows. So it's hard for us to say. What we find sometimes in the Archaic period is net sinkers, but we haven't been lucky enough to find any of those. Those are groundstone implements that are roughly bell-shaped, and they're worked around the top of it as if something was being tied around it. But unfortunately, those are not presenting themselves to us. We'd love to find them. We know they're around, but oh yeah. We have a lot of collectors show us their groundstone tools, but we unfortunately don't find many of them.
How long are you here for at this site?
It'll be a total of 25 days. We worked 9 days last week before the holidays. We're here for 10 days at this point. We work a schedule of 10 days on, 4 days off. So we'll be here. We got here Tuesday was our first day of work, and we'll be leaving next Thursday, leaving for 4 days and coming back for 5 more days.
And when you go to a site, do you get in touch with any of the Native Americans that are in the area?
Yes, we try to. Of course, most of the Abenaki are up north. We have a really big project in Swanton right now where we have, good contact with the Native Americans, and we have I think 3 or 4 Native Americans working with us on the site. So when we can, when it's possible, we welcome Native American involvement, absolutely. This one, honestly, it's a kind of above my level to make those calls. So, yeah.
Do we know what people or peoples
Well,
on sites?
I mean, you're talking about 4,000 years of occupation. Of course, the Native Americans present in Vermont claim heritage with these people, and we have no reason to think they don't have heritage with those people, but it's not something the archaeological record can answer. It's likely, of course, that there is cultural and demographic continuity between those people and the people living now. And in fact, I would say there's absolutely continuity. But again, that's issues of politics and such that aren't necessarily what we'd like to get involved in.
Who cares about the corn?
Who cares about the corn?
No, I'm curious
Oh.
about the corn. I mean, that seems pretty old. I think it was domesticated maybe 6,000 or 7,000 years ago.
Yep, in Mexico, yeah.
But by 4,000 years ago, it's already up here.
Yep.
Is that, how?
Oh, not up here. It would have been about 1,000 years ago. Was one of the early states in New England. So it was definitely in the Southwest much before that, and even to the west in the Ohio River Valley. 500, maybe 1,000 years before that. So it took its way. It took its time to work its way up, and it seems New England was essentially the last place to get corn as it moved out.
This site was,
About 600 years old,
Oh, okay.
so 1400s. And that's typical what you see the Iroquois Confederacy in New York. You have, the beginnings of large-scale sedentary agriculture, and it seems likely that it would have moved that way from the west towards New England. And we do find it in Maine as well, and in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. But it seems that this corner of the country was the last to really.
so it arrived here very close.
It just
600 or 700 years ago.
yeah, well, about 1,000 years ago.
Prior to contact.
Yeah, about 1,000 years ago. So let's see, contact's about 1600. You have Champlain 1623. So, a few hundred years before that.
Do we know what kind of shelters these people would have used?
Again, because the soil does not necessarily preserve things very well, like wooden posts, we do find post molds. We know that they were typically living in smaller size shelters, not the long houses you see typically, but we don't have a reason to believe they didn't build those. We just don't have necessarily evidence of those kind of long houses. I mean, so more of like a 3 or 4 person, a family structure instead of, a several family structure is what we think is more typical. But again, we can't say that definitively. It's just what we have from the best evidence. And it seems, obviously, with a more sedentary occupation like the one in Proctor, I mean, that's one of the things we're really excited about is maybe we can find some evidence of that, of longhouse construction. Maybe we can find a larger structure, because it is a nice, flat, open area that hasn't been, churned up too much, I don't think. We'll see.
So would they have been using logs or bark?
Absolutely, log and animal hides, of course. I mean, animal hides provide a shelter, weatherproofing, wind stoppage, stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I guess we can kind of assume that the bark was a major component, and hides, and shaping twigs into roofs and such. But again, it's all conjecture for the most part.
Do you ever use any kind of remote sensing? Like
Ground penetrating radar? No, we don't. Other archaeologists do, with access to more academic resources. I mean, typically, it's used a lot out west because you're not typically digging subsurface. You're looking for things on the surface, and then looking for, the features will be subsurface, but since they don't do a lot of actual excavation, because the deposition hasn't been as extensive as in the Northeast, they'll use the GPR to try to find house pits and burials and stuff like that. But in New England, most of the work we do is in forested areas, so it wouldn't really, we can't drag it up a mountain and tug it along. I mean, it would be nice to be able to use it in that site in Proctor. That might give us some ideas, but that's an expense and it's an expertise that we don't really have. So we rely on the test pits.
Are you seeing any evidence? At this point, this is for a portage.
Mhm.
It's a good spot for a portage.
Great spot.
Obviously, up above the falls, there's going to be a put in and take out spot.
Right.
As well. Are you finding any evidence up above?
We did do some testing up above, and we found a small site. There's a boat launch right over the bridge, and there's a boat launch right there.
Yeah.
We did find a small site there. Unfortunately, there was a house standing there, and at one point that was raised, and then gravel was brought in, and so we didn't really find that spot. It would be nice to find that spot, and we did on the other side of the river as well, and didn't really find much of anything. It's likely there is a sister spot to that site
Yeah,
up
'cause
above,
on the
but
same side of the river, there was another house site,
yeah,
right, where would be the obvious takeout.
yeah.
They wouldn't have taken out, I don't think, where the current takeout is.
No,
Because
it's
obviously then there's no way back across.
right. Yeah. It seems likely there is or was a spot, but it may be under feet of alluvium, or it may be gone, or
Yeah,
unfortunately we didn't hit it. We were lucky to get this one.
yeah.
Yeah.
Have you run into any of what we heard about at the last Indian encampment out at the Maritime Museum? They were talking about these stone structures. They're into the ground, and they're apparently not sure what they were used for, whether it was food storage or some sort of shelter.
They refer to them as a cairn.
I'm not quite sure. Sometimes, occasionally, you'll find a stone-lined storage pit, but it would be just basically cobbles kind of pressed into the earth. We don't find much like that. There's very little evidence of Native Americans using stones in any particular building kind of manner, but that doesn't mean they didn't. We just
Right.
haven't found anything like that, really. Okay. Well, I know Chris has to close up shop at about 10 of, so are there any more questions? Thank you. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.